Chief Executive Leung delivered his fifth and final policy address today. In view of Hong Kong's ageing population, he stressed the need to be well prepared for retirement protection. The chief executive ruled out a universal retirement protection scheme and chose to focus on better healthcare and subsidies for the elderly. Leung begins our coverage.
Hong Kong's population is aging fast. In 20 years, a third of the city's population will be aged 65 years or above. But in his annual policy address today, the chief executive said universal retirement protection is not the answer.
There's no one-size-fits-all approach. A flat rate payment by the government to all elderly persons, irrespective of financial means, will only dilute the support available to those in need.
Instead, the government chose to narrow down its approach to better subsidies and healthcare for the elderly. The old age living allowance asset limits will be relaxed. Currently, elderly singletons will be entitled to this allowance if their assets do not exceed $225,000. Beginning on February 1st, the limit will be raised to $329,000. Elderly singletons with fortunes under $144,000 will be entitled to a new, higher-tier assistance of $3,435 a month. That's about a third higher than the existing rate they are now eligible for. If implemented, both policies will benefit roughly 500,000 senior citizens. The annual public expenditure is around $7.6 billion, but the government ruled out tax increases for now. Question is, are these allowances sufficient to those in need?
It is useful for us to take a comprehensive view on all the support measures that we have in place for the elderly, and not just one of the pillars or one of the measures.
In terms of healthcare, recipients of the higher old age allowance who are also above 75 years old will enjoy free public hospital and clinic services. Those who prefer private healthcare can get $2,000 from the Elderly Healthcare Vouchers Scheme, which will see its eligibility age lowered from 70 to 65. It's not enough. Even a visit to the doctors in Sham Shui Po costs $300, said this 82-year-old. She's also upset that she worked hard and saved up $500,000, which prevents her from applying for the higher subsidies. Those hoping to receive elderly comprehensive social security assistance at 60 years old will now have to wait until they hit 65, as the government wants to align elderly policies with the extended retirement age. Whether or not the old age living allowance and healthcare services will be enhanced ultimately depends on the Legislative Council. The legislature must first approve funding before the government can implement these measures. Leung, TVB News.
Well, Leung also announced a much-anticipated plan to prevent employers from shortchanging their contribution to their employees' retirement schemes. But even though it's seen as heavily compromised, the business sector remains unhappy. Shu has more.
In today's speech, Leung proposed to progressively scrap the MPF offsetting mechanism, by which employers can use their share of a worker's mandatory provident fund to pay for their severance fees or long service payments. But the plan won't be retrospective, meaning offsetting will still be allowed before the plan's implementation date, which the speech didn't specify. Workers would also get less in their severance or long service payment, as the amount would be based on half a month of their wages rather than 2/3 as it is now. Even so, the government would share the extra financial burden employers would shoulder within 10 years of the plan's launch.
As employers may need to make provisions for LSPs, revenue foregone in the coming 10 years may amount to $18 billion. When the government no longer subsidizes employers in the 11th year, it may forego up to $2.6 billion in tax revenues per annum, and such loss will continue.
Still, the business sector is reluctant to pay what it sees as double benefits for workers.
That my constituents are disappointed. They have to actually find ways to come up with money in the next 5 or 10 years' time.
Danny Lau, representing local small and medium enterprises, warned some companies might fire their staff before the offsetting is scrapped and rehire them as contract workers, which they can fire more easily. Labour sector lawmaker Michael Leung, meanwhile, urged businesses not to block the progress on the issue that's been stalled by controversies.
So why did Leung leave this controversial issue to his final policy speech?
He claimed it was because so much time had been spent on political reforms, but he hoped he was able to come up with a feasible option that would lay the foundations for his successor to totally scrap the mechanism.
We will in the next 3 months consult widely the stakeholders concerned, including business and labour sector, with a view to coming up with a consensus on the way forward, and we'll wrap up by June before our term ends. Thank you.
Adam Xu, TVB News.
The chief executive also highlighted the use of land in his policy address. He says an out-of-the-box solution will be able to solve Hong Kong's housing woes. Evelina Leung has that story.
High property prices and rents have been a critical livelihood issue here in Hong Kong. That's according to Leung, who talked about land use in his policy address today. So, what is one solution to the problem? According to Leung, it's country parks. He said the most distinctive characteristic of land use planning is the high proportion of country parks, which accounts for 40% of the city's total land area. The CE did say the government is committed to environmental protection and ecological conservation.
And we should also consider allocating a small proportion of land on the periphery of country parks with relatively low ecological and public enjoyment value for purposes other than real estate development, such as public housing and non-profit making elderly homes.
Leung added if the community does not work with the government to identify land for housing supply, the housing problem will remain a tough nut to crack. Leung also revealed that his administration has identified an additional 25 plots besides the 190 that have already been set aside for housing purposes. The extra plots can produce more than 60,000 units, with more than 80% of them allocated for public housing between 2019 and 2024. Apart from housing, the government wants to redevelop the Wan Chai Sports Ground and turn it into a convention and exhibition center, along with trendy and novel recreation and sports facilities. However, not everyone agrees with Leung's proposals.
We need to remind ourselves the reason why the government set up country parks. It is not for this generation, but for many, many generations behind of us. And so we have to be very careful. And I don't think it is a good reason to develop any part of the country park.
Chu also argued that the government should consider using golf courses for development instead of the Wan Chai Sports Ground, which is used by many people. Evelyn Leung, TVB News.
Leung Cheng-ying announced an increase in hospital authority funding to help boost public healthcare services. But on education, the CE came under fire when he failed to mention the controversial TSA scheme for primary 3 children. Winnie Wong has that story.
More money for schools and hospitals in this year's policy address. Leung Cheng-ying announced a one-off grant of $125 million to boost the teaching of Chinese history and traditional Chinese culture in secondary schools. The government also wants to improve learning in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, the so-called STEM subjects. The CE said the Education Bureau plans to grant each public secondary school a one-off subsidy of $200,000 to implement STEM-related programs. But there was no mention of a territory-wide systems assessment for primary 3 students. Just last month, the government floated the idea of resuming the controversial test. The TSA was suspended for most schools last year after parents and teachers complained it was putting immense pressure on kids.
I think he deliberately avoided subjects. It has been a very big concern among Hong Kong parents and teachers. And the government should address that and to respond to the issue. I regret that it doesn't take up the issue.
As for the medical sector, an extra $2 billion for the hospital authority in 2017 to 18 will help increase the number of beds and operating theater sessions in public hospitals. Meantime, the CE said the West Kowloon Cultural District Authority would be granted the rights to develop hotels, offices, and residential facilities with the private sector through open tender. Critics said that means the government will not need to ask LegCo to approve funding for the arts hub. Now that the CE has delivered his final policy address in his term, Leung stressed he has basically fulfilled all his campaign promises.
I don't want to create any legacy, but I think it would be useful for everyone to actually go through the policy addresses of the past 5 years, including this one, and ask ourselves whether or not these are the right policies and measures that people in Hong Kong need, aspire to have.
Winner Wang, TVB News.